The screaming has stopped bothering me, not because I cannot hear it. My ears, or what remains of them, still function after a fashion, but because I have learned that the sound comes from inside my own chest cavity. The maggots produce it as they writhe through what was once my left lung. A high-pitched keening, almost musical, generated by their spiracles contracting against necrotic tissue. I have had 317 years to study this phenomenon, to map every sound my body makes as it perpetually dies without ever quite finishing the task. But let me tell you how I got here. Let me tell you about the moment I stopped being Brother Halvus of the Death Guard Legion and became something the Imperium would call abomination. The propaganda would later claim we chose this, that we willingly embraced corruption. They always lied about everything. This lie was no different. My name was Halvus Krend. I was 28 Terran Standard years old when I died the first time. I had served in the 14th Legion for 11 years, survived 43 campaigns, killed enemies I had been conditioned to hate across 17 worlds I could no longer name. I had brown hair, unusual for barbarous stock, and a scar across my left cheekbone from a training accident in my 3rd year as an aspirant. My father was a chemical refinery worker in the dead zones. I never knew his name. The Legion took me before such things mattered, but I remembered his hands, huge, scarred things that smelled of industrial solvents and burned flesh. He had lifted me once, just once, when I was selected for aspirant trials. Set me down without a word. That was the last time anyone touched me with something resembling gentleness. I also remembered wanting to see Terra, the throne world. Every legionary carried that dream, spoken or unspoken, to walk where the Emperor himself walked. To stand in the presence of the corpse thing they told us was divine, was our Gene Father's father, was humanity's salvation. I wanted to see if the propaganda was true. If he really was worth the oceans of blood we spilled in his name. I never got to Terra. I got Istvan III instead. The air on Istvan III tasted like cooked meat and melted plasteel. The virus bombing had turned the loyalist population into an organic slurry, but we had survived in the shelters, those of us the War Master had designated for extermination. The ones who still believed in the Emperor's lies. The ones who would not follow Horus into whatever new damnation he had planned. I was among them, though I had not understood why until the bombs fell. We emerged from the shelters into a landscape of rendered fat and bone fragments, fused into the rockcrete. The sun was a sick yellow thing behind clouds of aerosolized human tissue. And our brothers, our own legion, our battle brothers, were waiting for us with guns raised. I saw Sergeant Vastrom first. I had served in his squad for 4 years, had watched him field strip a bolter in 17 seconds, had heard him recite the litany of endurance 7,000 times during long transits, had stood beside him as we executed civilians on Kashtan Prime because they had been labeled heretic for refusing to meet grain quotas. We had been brothers in the way the Legion defined brotherhood. Shared suffering, shared murder, shared conditioning. He shot me without hesitation. The bolter round took me in the chest, just below the fused ribcage. At that range, 17 meters I calculated even as I fell, the mass reactive should have detonated inside my primary heart, should have turned my entire thoracic cavity into shrapnel and superheated gas. But the round was damaged, or old, or the Emperor's false protection had failed one final time. It punched through without detonating. Shattered 3 ribs, pulped my left lung, severed my subclavian artery, but did not explode. I went down hard, tasted blood and recycled air from my ruptured lung, heard my own armor's medical systems screaming alerts that no one would answer. Around me, the loyalists were dying in droves. Bolter fire, flamer wash. The heavy percussion of missile impacts. The Death Guard were thorough. We had always been thorough. That was what we did. We endured, and we killed everything that needed killing, and we never left tasks unfinished. I was a task that needed finishing. But in the chaos of betrayal, in the screaming confusion of brother murdering brother, I was overlooked. I lay there for 6 hours as the battle moved away, felt my blood pressure dropping as the artery poured my life into my chest cavity, felt my secondary heart struggling to compensate, overworking, beginning to fail, felt the damaged lung filling with blood and fluid, felt my body shutting down system by system. The augmentations kept me conscious far longer than any baseline human would have survived. That was their design, to keep a space marine fighting until the absolute final moment. To wring every second of combat capability from the investment of gene seed and surgery and conditioning. Even in death, we were assets to be utilized fully. I tried to pray. The words came automatically, beaten into my neurology through decades of repetition. The Emperor protects, the Emperor provides. In his name we endure. My blood continued to pool. Vastrum did not return to grant me mercy. The Emperor, if he existed as anything beyond propaganda and a corpse on a golden chair, did not reach down to save his faithful servant. I died alone on poisoned ground, betrayed by my legion, abandoned by the lies I had been taught to call faith. That should have been the end of Brother Halvus Krend. It was not. Consciousness returned like vomit rising, unwanted, inevitable, disgusting. I did not wake. Waking implies sleep, implies rest, implies a natural process. This was invasion. This was violation. This was something forcing its way into a corpse that should have been empty. The first thing I felt was cold. Not the cold of death. I was already dead, had been dead for hours. But the cold of meat left in open air. The cold of a body no longer maintaining homeostasis. My secondary heart had stopped. My primary heart was damaged beyond function. But I felt them anyway, felt the stillness in my chest that should have been rhythm. The second thing I felt was movement. Inside me, things were living in my corpse. I tried to scream. My lungs did not respond. The left was collapsed, full of congealed blood. The right had been damaged by rib fragments and was partially deflated. But I felt them both. Felt every square centimeter of tissue. Felt the intricate map of damage. Felt the larvae that had already begun to colonize the dead spaces. Flies, corpse flies. They had found me quickly in the charnel house atmosphere of Istvan III. Had crawled into my mouth, my nose, the wound channel in my chest, had laid their eggs in the warm places, the wet places. The eggs had hatched. I could feel them feeding, each one, individually. The maggots were small, rice grain-sized, soft-bodied. They secreted enzymes that liquefied my tissue so they could consume it. I felt those enzymes working. Felt my lung tissue dissolving, felt them burrowing deeper, creating channels, hollowing me out. I tried to move my hand, to reach up and claw them out. My arm did not respond. The muscles were dead. The neurons were dead. The synapses were gone. But I felt the arm. Felt it with perfect, excruciating clarity. Felt every muscle fiber going rigid with rigor mortis. Felt the breakdown beginning as cells ruptured and proteins denatured. This was not life. This was awareness trapped inside death. I tried to understand. My mind, trained for tactical analysis, for threat assessment, for problem solving, struggled to process the contradiction. Dead bodies do not think. Dead brains do not generate consciousness. The electrochemical processes that create thought require living neurons, require oxygen, require circulation. I had none of these things. Yet I thought, yet I was aware. The logical conclusion was unacceptable. The propaganda had taught us about the warp, about the entities that lived there, parasites that the texts called gods, but which we understood as predatory intelligences feeding on human suffering. We had been taught they were the enemy, that they corrupted, that they destroyed everything they touched. We had been taught the Emperor protected us from them. The Emperor was not protecting me. Something else was. Time passed. I could not measure it. My armor's chronometer was still functioning. I could hear it. A faint tick, tick, tick against my breastplate, but I could not see it. My eyes were open. I knew this because I felt the flies crawling across them, felt their tiny legs on my corneas, felt them drinking the vitreous fluid, but I saw nothing. The optic nerves were dead. I existed in absolute darkness, in absolute stillness, while my body rotted around my consciousness. The maggots grew. I felt them growing, felt them molting, shedding their skins inside me, felt them becoming larger, more voracious. They had finished with my left lung and were starting on the liver. The liver had been massive, oversized like all Astartes' organs. Now it was a buffet. They tunneled through it, leaving channels full of their waste and liquefied tissue. My digestive system was failing, not functioning. It had stopped functioning when I died. Failing structurally. The intestinal walls were breaking down. Bacteria, my own gut bacteria, the ones that had lived symbiotically in my system for years, were escaping containment. They were eating me from inside, producing gases, methane, hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide. I was bloating. I felt my abdomen distending, felt the pressure building, felt my abdominal wall stretching. The skin should have ruptured, should have split and released the pressure. It did not. Something was holding me together. Something was keeping the vessel intact even as the contents putrefied. Days passed. I knew this because the maggots completed their cycle. They pupated. I felt them forming chrysalises inside my chest cavity, inside my abdomen, in the hollows of my pelvis, felt them hanging there dormant, then felt them emerging. Adult flies, dozens of them, crawling through my interior, seeking exit. They found my wounds, the entry wound in my chest, my mouth, my nose. They crawled out, and the vibration of their wings against dead tissue created sounds I could hear through bone conduction. A buzzing, low, constant. But they did not all leave. Some stayed, some bred. The cycle continued. I was becoming an ecosystem. More time. The bloating worsened. I felt like an overfilled water skin. Felt the gases pressing against every internal surface. My stomach was distended grotesquely. I could not see it, but I knew. Knew with the same certainty I knew the layout of wounds I could not see, the position of organs I could not touch. Then I felt new movement, different from the maggots, slower, deliberate. Something was growing in me. Not larvae, not flies, something else. Fungal structures, mycelia, thread-thin filaments spreading through dead tissue like roots through soil. They fed on decay, produced more decay, broke down complex proteins into simpler compounds. They were everywhere, in my muscles, in my bones, in the spaces between vertebrae. And they connected. The filaments formed networks, created pathways, almost like neurons, almost like the synaptic architecture of a brain. I felt my awareness expanding along those pathways, felt myself spreading through my own corpse. I was not located in my brain anymore. My brain was soup. The flies had been thorough, but I was still here, still conscious. My awareness now existed in the fungal network, in the bacterial colonies, in the entire rotting mass that had once been Brother Halvis Krend. Time continued its crawl. Weeks, perhaps. I had lost count. The chronometer still ticked, but I could no longer track the intervals. My sense of duration was breaking down along with my body. New sensations began. Impossible sensations. I felt sunlight, not on my skin. My skin was leather, dried and cracking, insensate. But I felt photons striking my body. Felt them as warmth. Not physical warmth. Some other kind. The fungal structures were photosensitive. They knew light from dark. Through them, I knew. I felt vibrations in the ground, footsteps, combat boots, armor servos. My body had become a sensor array. Every part of me that touched the ground transmitted information. Someone was approaching. Scavengers, most likely. The battle had moved to other sectors of Istvan III. Now came the ones who picked through the aftermath, looking for salvage, for gene seed, for anything of value among the mountains of dead. I felt hands on my armor, felt them trying to release the seals. The mechanisms were fused with dried blood and fluid. They would not open easily. A voice, muffled by my dead ears, but I heard it through vibration. This one's been here a while. Probably nothing worth. Emperor's throne, the smell. The Emperor's throne. They still invoked him, still believed the propaganda, still thought he cared about his rotting sons. The hands withdrew, footsteps retreated. I was not worth the effort of opening. Too far gone. Too corrupted. They were correct. Months passed. Seasons changed on Istvan III. I felt temperature shifts, felt moisture levels rise and fall. Rain fell sometimes. Water seeped through the cracks in my armor. It should have washed away the corruption, diluted the rot. Instead, it fed it. The fungal networks loved the moisture. They grew explosively after each rain. Fruiting bodies formed. Mushrooms pushing up through the wound channel in my chest. I felt them growing, felt their caps expanding, felt them releasing spores, millions of spores, carried on the wind, seeking new dead tissue to colonize. I was reproducing. The thought was obscene. I was dead. The dead do not reproduce, but the things living in me, the things I was becoming part of, they reproduced constantly. And I felt it all. Felt their success, their expansion, felt something that might have been satisfaction if I still had the neurology for emotions. I did not. Emotions required a limbic system. Mine was gone, eaten months ago. But I felt something, some analog, some new capacity that arose from the fungal network and the bacterial colonies and the organized decay that I had become. A year passed. I knew because the scavengers returned annually to comb the battlefield for anything previous sweeps had missed. They came 3 times. Each time they found me. Each time they recoiled from the sight and smell. Each time they left me where I lay. By the 3rd time, I was no longer recognizable as a space marine. My armor was green with corrosion and biological growth. Vines, actual plants, had taken root in the organic matter that leaked from my seals. They covered my left leg, grew up my side, flowered in the Istvan III spring. I was becoming landscape. My armor should have failed. The servos should have seized. The power plant should have died. But it did not. Something was maintaining it. Something was keeping the systems active, the joints flexible. The same something that kept my consciousness bound to this rotting shell. In the Lectitio Divinitatis, the religious text the Emperor's most fervent believers circulated, the one we had been taught to recognize as heresy, there were passages about divine transformation, about suffering leading to transcendence, about death being a doorway to the Emperor's side. More lies. There was no transcendence, no divinity, no emperor waiting to embrace his faithful dead. There was only this, consciousness trapped in decay, awareness without reprieve, existence without purpose or end. I began to understand what had happened. The words they had taught us came back, filtered through new comprehension. The warp entities, the parasites that called themselves gods. One of them had claimed me, had done something to me as I died, had bound my consciousness to my corpse and prevented me from dying fully. This was its gift. This was what the propaganda had warned us about. Corruption, transformation, damnation. The indoctrination programs had taught us to resist, to maintain purity, to reject any touch from the warp. I tried. For that first year, I tried. Maintained the mental disciplines, recited the litanies of hate silently in the darkness of my skull, clung to identity, to the memory of who I had been. Brother Halvus Krend, death guard, loyal servant of the Emperor, betrayed but not broken. But the litanies meant nothing. The Emperor's name was just sound. The identity I clung to was attached to a body that no longer existed. I was not Brother Halvus. I was the thing eating Brother Halvus from inside. Year 2 brought new developments. The fungal network had grown sophisticated, complex. It formed structures analogous to ganglia, to neural clusters. My awareness, which had been diffuse and scattered, began to consolidate again. to focus. I could think more clearly, process information more rapidly. I was becoming intelligent again. Not human intelligent. Something else. Something adapted to this existence. And I began to feel not happy, not content, but something, an absence of distress. The horror that had consumed me in those first months was fading. The wrongness of my existence was becoming normal, was becoming simply existence. I was adapting. This realization should have horrified me, should have driven me to some final desperate attempt to end myself. But I could not end myself. I had tried to will my heart to stop before I realized it had already stopped, had tried to stop breathing before I realized I had not drawn breath in months, had tried to starve myself before I realized I was already dead, and starvation was irrelevant. There was no escape, only acceptance or madness. I chose acceptance, or perhaps acceptance chose me. Perhaps it was not choice at all, but inevitable progression, the natural endpoint of consciousness imprisoned in decay. Year 3, the fungal structures in my body began producing compounds, chemical signals. I felt them circulating through what remained of my vascular system, absorbed by tissues that should not have been able to absorb anything. The compounds were psychoactive. They changed perception, changed thought. They made the decay feel comfortable, made the rot feel like home, made the maggots feel like children and their feeding feel like purpose. I was being drugged by my own corruption, and I welcomed it. The alternative was eternal screaming, eternal horror at what I had become. The compounds offered peace, offered something resembling happiness. It was not real happiness. I understood this even as I felt it. It was chemically induced, artificially maintained. But it was real in the only way that mattered. I felt it. Year 4 brought visitors, not scavengers this time. Something else. I felt them approaching long before they arrived, felt vibrations in the ground, heavy footsteps, power armor, multiple suits, a squad perhaps, maybe more. They stopped near me. I felt their boots impact the ground all around my position, felt the air pressure change as they moved. One knelt beside me, put a hand on my breastplate. A voice, deep, rough, filtered through a Vox grill. This one still has power. Reactor signature is active. Another voice, after 4 years, impossible. Nothing survives that long without maintenance. He's not surviving. Look at him. He's been dead for years, but something is keeping the armor functional. A pause. Then, grandfather's touch. Grandfather. The word meant nothing to me. Should have meant nothing. But something in the fungal network responded, stirred, like recognition. Extract him. Bring him back. The plague surgeons will want to examine this. Hands gripped my armor, began to lift. I felt my body coming free from the ground where I had lain for 4 years. Felt soil and plant roots tearing away from armor. Felt fluids draining from cracks. Felt things, insects probably, or small scavengers that had been living in the sheltered spaces of my body, fleeing the disturbance. I was being moved. After 4 years of stillness, I was being transported. The motion was agony, not physical pain. My nerves were long dead. But disruption. My body had settled into equilibrium with the ground, had become part of the local ecosystem. Now that balance was being destroyed, I felt systems failing that I had not known existed, felt fungal networks tearing, felt bacterial colonies being disrupted. I was dying. Again. But I did not die. Something held me together, held the awareness intact even as the body fell apart further. Held me in existence because that was the gift I had been given. Not life, not death, but eternal awareness of decay. They carried me for hours. I tracked the passage of time by counting footsteps, by measuring the vibrations as they walked. 647,000 steps, approximately 17 kilometers. Then we stopped. New sounds, machinery, hydraulics, a ramp lowering. I was being taken inside something, a ship, probably a transport. The air changed, became enclosed, filtered, but it still stank. Stank of the same decay that filled my own body. This ship smelled like death, like rot, like home. I was placed on the surface. Cold metal, a surgical table perhaps. Hands began removing my armor. The process was slow. 4 years of biological growth had fused the pieces. They cut through fungal structures, through plant matter, through layers of dried fluids. Each cut vibrated through my body. I felt them all. The breastplate came off. Cool air touched my chest cavity, touched the wound channel that had become a garden. I heard sounds of disgust, of fascination, a new voice, older, calmer, clinical, fascinating. The decay is not random. Look at these structures. This organization, the fungal networks have formed almost neural architecture, and he's still producing power armor interface signals. The armor recognized him as alive. He's not alive, plague surgeon. No, not alive, but not dead either. Not in any final sense. Something is maintaining consciousness. Something is binding his awareness to the decay process itself. Nurgle's blessing. There. The name, the entity, the warp parasite that had claimed me. Nurgle. The propaganda had taught us the name. One of the 4 great parasites, the one associated with decay, with entropy, with the eventual heat death of the universe. The one that called itself grandfather, that promised acceptance and peace through corruption. The one that had done this to me. I should have felt rage, should have rejected the name with every fragment of willpower remaining. That was what loyal servants of the Emperor did. We resisted corruption, we maintained purity even in death. But I felt no rage. The fungal network processed the information and produced curiosity, interest, a desire to understand this force that had claimed me. I was already lost. I had been lost for years. I was only now beginning to realize it. The plague surgeon continued his examination, took samples, cultured them, studied the organisms that composed me, spoke into recording devices documenting every detail. Time passed. Hours, days perhaps. Then he spoke to me. "Can you hear me, brother? Can you understand?" I could not answer. Had no lungs to breathe, no larynx to vibrate, no tongue to shape words. But I tried to move, tried to make some sound. The fungal structure in my throat shifted. Spores released. Gas escaped from my esophagus. It produced a sound. A wet, rattling hiss. The plague surgeon leaned closer. "You can hear. Good. Good. Listen carefully. You have been touched by Grandfather Nurgle. You have been given a gift. The gift of awareness within decay. The gift of eternal life through death. You are becoming something new. Something beyond the weakness of living flesh. Do you understand?" I tried to answer again. Managed another hiss. "That was all. We will help you complete the transformation. We'll give you the tools to continue existing, to serving, to embracing what you have become. Grandfather loves all his children, especially those who have suffered as you have suffered." He called it love. This parasitic entity that had trapped me in a rotting corpse for 4 years called it love. But the fungal network processed the word and found it accurate. In some way, some terrible way. I had been abandoned on Istvan III, left to die meaninglessly. The Emperor, if he existed, had not saved me. My legion had betrayed me, but this entity, this parasite calling itself Nurgle, had noticed, had claimed me, had kept me in existence when I should have dispersed into nothing. That was attention. That was regard. If I had still possessed the neurology for emotions, I might have called it love. The plague surgeons worked on me for weeks. They could not restore what was dead. The dead remain dead. That is the universe's law. But they could augment, could integrate, could merge what remained of my space marine body with systems that accepted decay as a feature rather than a failure state. They installed new organs, Not living ones, semi-living ones, organs that functioned on the border between life and death, a second stomach that digested decay products and produced nutrients for the fungal networks, glands that secreted compounds to stabilize the rot, to keep me at optimal decomposition, dead enough to be filled with the organisms I needed, alive enough to maintain structure. They replaced my eyes. The new ones were compound, like an insect's. They saw in spectrums no human eye could perceive, saw bacterial concentrations as heat signatures, saw fungal spores as glowing particles, saw decay as beautiful complexity instead of horror. They rebuilt my vocal system, gave me a bellows where my right lung had been, a resonating chamber where my throat had been. I could speak again, could make sounds. The voice was not mine, was thick and wet and wrong, but it was voice. And they gave me armor, new armor, ceramite fused with organic compounds, armor that breathed, that grew, that accepted the plants and fungi that wanted to colonize it, armor that was not sealed against contamination but open to it, welcoming it. I was rebuilt, remade, not resurrected, made into something that had never existed before. When the work was complete, they stood me before a reflective surface, showed me what I had become. I was massive, had always been massive. Astartes' physiology ensured that, but now I was bloated with decay. My armor bulged with organic growth. Vines grew from the seals. Mushrooms fruited from the joints. The breastplate was cracked, and through the crack I could see my chest cavity, a garden of rot, organized and vital and obscene. My helmet was antlered with bone growths. The lenses were fogged with condensation. Flies crawled across the faceplate, inside and out. I looked at this reflection and felt pride. The thought was wrong. I knew it was wrong. Brother Halvus Krend would have been horrified, would have maintained hatred for what had been done to him. But I was not Brother Halvus anymore. I had not been him for years. I was what came after, what grew in his corpse, what emerged from his decay. I was Plague Marine. The title meant nothing to me initially, just words. But the plague surgeons explained, showed me others, brothers like me, dead but aware, rotting but functional, claimed by the entity they called Grandfather, transformed into warriors who weaponized decay. There were thousands of us, former Death Guard mostly, former loyalists who had died on Istvan III or in the years after, claimed by Nurgle, remade, given purpose through corruption. They explained the theology. I listened with my new insect eyes and my fungal network mind. They spoke of Nurgle as a god. I understood this was propaganda, that the entity was simply a warp parasite, a predatory intelligence feeding on suffering. But I also understood that the distinction was meaningless. Whether god or parasite, it had power. It had claimed me. It had given me awareness when I should have had oblivion. They spoke of his gifts, the gift of decay, the gift of peace within corruption, the gift of freedom from the terror of death. They called him benevolent, loving, the only entity in the universe that accepted all things as they truly were. I did not believe in his divinity, could not. My indoctrination ran too deep, but I believed in his attention, his regard, his claimed love for his children. Because I felt it, through the fungal network, through the bacterial colonies, through every organism that composed me, I felt connection, felt awareness touching mine, not words, not thoughts, but presence, vast and patient and inexorable as entropy. Nurgle, the parasite, the thing wearing divinity as a mask. It was aware of me, had always been aware of me. From the moment I died on Istvan III, it had noticed, had claimed, had kept. And it offered me something the Emperor never had, acceptance of what I was, not what I could become through service, not what I might be worth as a weapon, but what I was right now, in this moment. A rotting corpse animated by awareness, valuable simply for existing. The lie was comforting. I knew it was a lie. Knew I was being manipulated by an entity that wanted to use me as I had been used by the Emperor. Different master, same slavery. But the lie felt like truth, felt like home. That was when I understood I was truly lost. Year 5, I was deployed. Given weapons, a bolter that fired diseased rounds, a plague knife that wept toxins, given a squad of brothers like me, dead things that moved and fought and spread corruption wherever we walked. We were sent to worlds that resisted the War Master, worlds that still believed in the Emperor's lies. We brought them truth. The truth of decay. The truth that all things rot eventually, and fighting the process only extends the suffering. I killed thousands, infected millions, watched populations collapse into the same rot that I embodied, watched them die screaming, then watched awareness return to some of them, watched them join us, become us. This was my purpose now, not to serve the Emperor's vision, not to bring compliance to the galaxy, but to spread the truth of entropy. To show humanity that decay was not the enemy but the destination, that accepting it brought peace. I did not enjoy it. Enjoyment required dopamine, required neural reward pathways I no longer possessed. But I felt satisfaction, felt the fungal network processing success, felt the bacterial colonies thriving, felt the connection to that vast presence deepen with each world corrupted. Year 17. I had stopped counting individual kills. The numbers became meaningless after the first 100,000. Stopped mattering. Each world was the same. Resistance, bombardment, ground assault, plague deployment, collapse, conversion. The pattern repeated until it was simply what I did, what I was. My body continued to evolve. The fungal networks had become so sophisticated they could regenerate damaged tissue. Not healing, but replacement. If my arm was severed, the fungi would grow into the shape of an arm, would create structures that functioned like muscle and bone, but were actually organized decay. I was becoming less flesh and more ecosystem with each passing year. My memories of being human grew distant, not lost. The fungal network stored everything, preserved consciousness with perfect fidelity, but remote. Like memories of someone else's life. I remembered Halvis Krend, remembered his fears and hopes and the dream of seeing terror. But those feelings were alien now, belonged to a creature I no longer was. We assaulted a world called Disara in that 17th year. Industrial planet, 16 billion inhabitants, massive manufactorums producing weapons for the Emperor's war machine. The War Master wanted it neutralized. We were the neutralization. The plague bombs hit first, biological weapons carrying 17 different engineered diseases. The pathogens were my brother's work. Plague marines, who had once been apothecaries, who understood human biology well enough to unmake it. The diseases were beautiful in their complexity, self-modifying, resistant to treatment. Designed not to kill quickly, but to weaken, to break down immune systems, to prepare populations for the final gift. We made planetfall 3 weeks after the initial bombardment. The cities were graveyards. Bodies filled the streets in drifts like snow. The smell would have been overwhelming to living soldiers. To us, it was home, was comfort, was the perfume of inevitability. But some survived. Some always survived. Humans are resilient. They hide, they adapt, they cling to life with desperate strength. We found them in the deep shelters, in the sealed sections of manufactorums, in underground complexes where air recyclers had filtered out the pathogens. They fought. Emperor, they fought hard. They had been conditioned just as I had been conditioned, taught that the Emperor protects, that faith is armor, that resistance to corruption is the highest virtue. They screamed prayers as they fired their weapons, invoked his name as we cut them down. Their prayers went unanswered. They always did. The Emperor, if he existed as more than propaganda and a corpse, did not intervene, did not protect, did not save. We killed them, and we infected them, and we moved on. But one of them spoke to me before he died. A boy. Couldn't have been more than 16. He was already infected. I could see the boils rising on his neck, smell the fever cooking his brain. He was dead, just didn't know it yet. He looked up at me with eyes that still held hope. still believed salvation was possible. And he asked, "Why? Why are you doing this?" I could have ignored him. Should have. He was irrelevant, dead meat that hadn't stopped moving yet. But something in the fungal network processed the question, found it interesting. I spoke. My voice was a wet rasp, words bubbling through decay. Because it is truth, because everything rots, because fighting it only prolongs suffering. Because grandfather loves all his children, and decay is his embrace. The boy's face twisted, horror, disgust, rejection. That's not love, that's evil. The Emperor. The Emperor does not protect, I interrupted. You were taught he protects. You were conditioned to believe. But look around you. Where is his protection? Where is his intervention? You prayed. He did not answer. You obeyed. He did not save you. The Emperor is a lie you were told to keep you obedient. No. No, the boy coughed. Blood sprayed from his lips. The diseases were accelerating. His immune system was collapsing. You are dying, I told him. The Emperor will not prevent it. But grandfather might grant you awareness, might let you continue, might give you peace in decay. That is more than your corpse guard ever offered. The boy died still denying it, still clinging to the propaganda, still believing the lies would save him. He did not rise. Not everyone did. Nurgle was selective in his gifts. Most simply died and rotted without awareness, without continuation. They received oblivion, which was mercy. I received awareness, which was damnation disguised as blessing. Year 32. I participated in the siege of Terra, walked on the ground I had dreamed of seeing as a young legionary, but not as a loyal son coming home, as an invader, as a plague-bearer bringing entropy to the Emperor's doorstep. Terra stank, smelled of incense and propaganda and desperation. The priests had told populations the Emperor's presence would protect them, that standing on his world made them safe. More lies. We brought plague to the throne world just as we brought it everywhere else. The Emperor's proximity changed nothing. I fought in the corridors of the Imperial Palace, walked halls where my gene-father had once walked when he was loyal. The architecture was grand, oppressive, designed to make humans feel small and powerless, to reinforce the Emperor's overwhelming authority. It felt empty to me. Just stone and metal, just matter waiting to decay. We were driven back eventually. The siege failed. Horus was killed, or so the reports claimed. The traitor legions retreated into the Eye of Terror. We followed, not in defeat, but in acceptance. The Eye was where we belonged, where decay thrived, where entropy was not fought but celebrated. The Eye of Terror became home. If home could be defined as a place where reality had collapsed, where physics were suggestions, where time moved in loops and spirals, and sometimes not at all. It was madness made geography, and we lived there for centuries. I watched brothers go mad, watched their minds fragment under the contradictions of existence in the warp, watched them devolve into screaming things that had lost all coherence. But not me. The fungal network was too distributed to break. My consciousness was stored across too many nodes. I could not go mad because I was not singular enough to lose coherence. Instead, I changed in other ways. Year 118. I realized I no longer thought in words. The internal monologue that had defined human consciousness was gone, replaced with something else, pattern recognition, gestalt awareness. I perceived situations as complete systems rather than sequences of events, thought in networks rather than chains. Language became difficult. When I needed to communicate, I had to translate these system thoughts back into linear words. The process was slow, inefficient. Most of the time, I simply did not bother, let others interpret my silence however they wished. Year 163. I realized I had forgotten what anger felt like. Could remember that I had once experienced it, could remember the physiological state, increased heart rate, adrenaline release, focused aggression, but could not reproduce the feeling. The emotional architecture was gone. consumed by fungi or bacteria, or simply dissolved into the collective awareness that I had become. I tried to feel rage at what had been done to me, tried to summon hatred for Nurgle, for the traitor legions, for the Emperor who had created us and then let us fall. Tried to feel anything that resembled human emotion. Nothing came. Only observation, only analysis, only the calm acceptance of entropy. I was becoming what they wanted, what Grandfather wanted, a perfectly willing servant. Not because I was broken or controlled, but because I had changed so fundamentally that service and self were indistinguishable. Year 207. A new Plague Marine was brought to my warband. Fresh, only dead for a few months, still screaming inside his head. I could tell from how he moved. The jerky, resistant motions, the attempts to fight what his body had become. I remembered that resistance, remembered the horror, felt nothing observing it now. But I spoke to him anyway, translated my system thoughts into words he could comprehend. It becomes easier, I told him. He turned his bloated head toward me. Maggots fell from his eye sockets. His voice was a shriek. I don't want it to become easier. I want to die. Please, brother, please kill me. You are already dead, I said. This is after. Then let me end. Let me stop. I can't. I can't bear feeling the rot, feeling them eating me, please. Remembered begging for oblivion. But that was centuries ago. A different person, a different existence. You will adapt, I told him. The horror fades. The wrongness becomes normal. Eventually you will find comfort in what you are. Peace in the decay. That is Grandfather's gift. That's not a gift. That's violation. That's torture. Yes, I agreed. It is, but it is also eternal, and eternity changes perspective. Give it a century, you will understand. He did not believe me. They never did. But he would learn. They always learned. Or they went mad, and madness was its own form of acceptance. Year 294. I met others who had been on Istvan III, fellow Death Guard who had been betrayed and claimed. We did not reminisce, did not share stories of who we had been before. The past was irrelevant. But we recognized each other, saw the particular quality of decay that marked the Istvan veterans, saw the depth of time and how we moved, how we existed. One of them had been Sergeant Vastrom, the one who shot me. I recognized him by his armor's markings, still barely visible under centuries of corrosion and growth. I felt no anger seeing him, no desire for revenge. He had pulled the trigger, yes, but it was meaningless. He had been following orders, doing his function. If not him, someone else would have shot me. The specific individual was irrelevant, but I spoke to him anyway. You killed me on Istvan. He turned, studied me with compound eyes similar to mine. His voice was a death rattle. Did I? I killed thousands on Istvan. Which one were you? Halvus Krend, your squad, 4 years under your command. He was silent for a long moment, processing. Then, I remember. The one the bolter round didn't kill cleanly. I meant to finish you. The battle moved before I could return. Yes. Are you angry? No. Will you seek recompense? No. It does not matter. You gave me to Grandfather, inadvertently, but the result is the same. I should perhaps thank you. He made a sound that might have been laughter, wet and bubbling. We are beyond gratitude and grudges, brother, beyond all the emotions that made us human. We simply continue. That is all. Yes, I agreed. We continue. And we did. Century after century. Warfare became ritual, not fought for territory or ideology, but for the act itself, for the spreading of decay, for the fulfillment of function. We were weapons, and weapons exist to be used. Year 341. I noticed that my sense of self was degrading. Not gone, I still had awareness, still had continuity of consciousness, but the boundaries were becoming porous. Sometimes I was not sure if a memory was mine or belonged to one of the bacterial colonies or the fungal networks. Sometimes I thought with the maggot's thoughts, perceived with the fly's perceptions. I was becoming plural, becoming collective, becoming swarm. This should have been horrifying, the ultimate loss of identity, but it felt natural, felt like the next stage of transformation. Individual consciousness was a human thing. I was no longer human. Why cling to human ways of being? Year 419, we assaulted a fortress monastery of the Ultramarines, loyalist space marines, still believing in the Emperor's lies, still fighting for a corpse on a throne. They fought well, disciplined, coordinated. Everything the Death Guard had once been before the betrayal, before the gifts, before the decay. I killed 17 of them, watched their faith fail to protect them, watched them die believing the Emperor would avenge them, would remember their sacrifice, would honor their service. He would not. He never did. The Emperor used his servants and discarded them, same as Nurgle, same as any power structure. The only difference was Nurgle admitted what he was, did not pretend to divinity, did not demand belief in his benevolence, simply offered gifts and accepted whatever came. One of the Ultramarines, dying, looked up at me and spoke, "You were one of us once, a space marine, a brother. How can you bear what you've become?" I considered the question, translated my system thoughts into words. I bear it because I have no choice, because awareness does not end, because this is what I am, but also because I have learned something you do not yet know. Decay is inevitable. Fighting it is meaningless. Accepting it brings peace. I have peace, brother. Do you? He died without answering. But his eyes, in that final moment, held doubt, held the beginning of understanding, held the crack through which truth could enter. Perhaps he would join us eventually. Perhaps grandfather would claim him too. I would not know, would not remember. One death among trillions. Year 562. I participated in a campaign that lasted 87 years. I know this only because others told me afterward. To me, it was a single extended moment. Time had lost meaning. Past and present and future blurred together. I existed in a state of eternal now, moving through battles that had no beginning nor end. This was when I realized I had achieved something like enlightenment. Not the spiritual transcendence the Emperor's priests promised, not ascension to divinity, but acceptance. Complete acceptance of what I was, what I had become, what I would be forever. I was decay, was entropy, was the eventual fate of all organized matter. Fighting this truth was the source of all suffering. Accepting it was liberation. The Buddhists, an ancient Terran philosophy I had been taught about in my youth, spoke of ending suffering through ending desire. Through accepting impermanence, they were almost correct. But they did not understand that the consciousness itself was the problem, that awareness perpetuated suffering. Unless that awareness was transformed, unless it accepted decay as not merely inevitable, but desirable, good, the natural state of all things. I had achieved that acceptance, and in achieving it, I had become grandfather's perfect child. Year 693, a new recruit asked me how long I had been dead. I had to think, had to count backward through centuries. 742 years, I told him. Give or take, time is difficult to measure in the eye. He was silent. Processing, then. Does it get better? No, I said. It does not get better, but you stop wanting it to be better. You stop comparing it to life. You accept it as existence, and existence is enough. That sounds like death. It is death. But it is also awareness within death. That is the gift, the curse, the eternal state grandfather provides. Why? Why does he do this? I had asked myself this question for centuries, had developed answers. Because he feeds on decay. Because consciousness within decay is more useful than simple rot. Because we serve him better aware than we would as mindless corpses. Because he is a parasite, and this is how he reproduces, by claiming the dying and transforming them into vectors for his influence. Take your pick. All are probably true. You sound like you hate him. I do not hate. Hate requires passion. I observe. I understand. I accept. Grandfather is what he is. I am what I am. We exist in relationship. Whether that relationship is called worship or slavery or symbiosis is irrelevant. It simply is. Year 804. I realized I could no longer remember my father's face. Could remember that I had a father. Could remember his hands, scarred and chemical burned. But the face was gone. Lost to centuries and transformation and the dissolution of neural structures that stored visual memory. This was when I understood that the last pieces of Halvus Krend were finally disappearing. Soon there would be nothing left of the human I had been, only the thing I had become. I tried to feel sadness at this loss, tried to mourn the passing of my original self, but I felt nothing. Only observation, only the calm notation that change had occurred. Halvus Krend had died on Istvan III, 7 centuries ago. What walked around wearing his armor and speaking with his voice was something else. Something that had grown in his corpse. Something that had consumed his identity along with his tissue. I was not Halvus Krend. I was his decay. His entropy, his inevitable end made animate. And I was content with this. Year 917, we received new recruits from a recent campaign. Fresh dead, still horrified, still clinging to who they had been. I watched them the way I once might have watched maggots, with detached interest, with awareness that they would change, would adapt, would eventually become like me. It was inevitable, just as decay was inevitable. One of them approached me. Young, had only been dead a few weeks. His voice was still relatively clear. How do you bear it? The others say you've been like this for almost a millennium. How have you not gone mad? Madness is a human concept, I told him. I am not human, therefore madness is not applicable. But you were human once. Don't you miss it? Don't you want to be alive again? I considered this carefully. Tried to remember wanting life. Tried to access emotions that had dissolved centuries ago. Life is a temporary state, I finally said. A brief organization of matter that resists entropy, but entropy always wins. Always. Life ends. Death is eternal. I exist in the eternal state. Why would I wish to return to the temporary? Because life has meaning, has purpose. No, life has assigned meaning, has constructed purpose. But these are illusions. Comforting lies organisms tell themselves to justify continued existence. I exist beyond those lies. I see clearly, see that meaning is fiction and purpose is programming. All that remains when illusions are stripped away is existence itself. And existence is enough. He stared at me with eyes that still held horror. You're not enlightened, you're just broken. Perhaps, I agreed. The distinction is meaningless. Broken or enlightened, I continue. That is all. He walked away, would probably spend the next century fighting what he had become, would eventually fail, would eventually arrive at acceptance. They always did. Or they went mad, and madness was also a form of acceptance. Year 1043. I participated in a raid on a forge world, Mechanicus territory. The priests of Mars with their machine worship, their belief in the Omnisire, their rituals that disguised maintenance as prayer. They fought with religious fervor, believed their machine god would protect them, believed their prayers to the Omnisire would empower their weapons, believed faith in technology was sacred. All lies, all conditioning. The machine god was propaganda. The Omnisire was myth. Their rituals were cargo cult behavior masking actual technical knowledge. But they believed with the same fervent desperation humans had always invested in their false gods. We corrupted their machines, infected them with rust plagues and data predators, turned their sacred technology against them, showed them that the machine god did not protect, that the Omnisire did not intervene, that their faith was empty ritual. Some broke, some went mad, some in desperation called out to Nurgle, begged for salvation from any source. A few were answered, were given the gift, were transformed into something new. Fusion of flesh and machine, both decaying simultaneously, both aware. I watched them transform and felt kinship. They were like me, had been betrayed by their faith, had discovered their gods were lies, had been claimed by the only entity honest enough to admit what it was, a parasite, a predator, a force of entropy wearing divinity as camouflage. Nurgle did not love us. Love required capacity for positive emotion, required desire for another's well-being. Nurgle was incapable of such things. But he claimed us, noticed us, kept us in existence. And that was more than any other power had offered. Year 1279. I stood on the hull of a ship during the Void battle, stood in vacuum without a sealed helmet. My body no longer required pressure or atmosphere. The organisms that composed me were adapted to survive anywhere, in fire, in ice, in void, in acid. I was unkillable, not immortal. Immortal implies living forever, but unkillable. Destroy my body and the awareness would persist in the fragments, would regrow, would reconstitute. Death had no power over me because I was already dead. Had been dead for more than a millennium. Stars wheeled overhead, cold and distant and beautiful. They were burning, converting mass to energy, fighting entropy. They would lose eventually, would exhaust their fuel, would collapse, would die. But not me. I would continue, would exist long after the last stars went cold, would persist in the heat death of the universe, would be there when entropy finally won its war against organization. That was the true gift, not life, not power, but continuation, existence without end, awareness without termination. Some would call it hell, eternal consciousness trapped in decay, unable to end, unable to rest, unable to achieve oblivion. But I called it peace, called it home. Called it the natural state of all things once the illusions of life were stripped away. Year 1416. I encountered an Eldar Farseer, one of the dying race, clinging to survival, fighting their own entropy. She looked at me with alien eyes and spoke. You are an abomination, a mockery of life. How can you exist like this? How can you exist believing death is avoidable? I countered. Your race is dying, has been dying for millennia. You fight and struggle and desperately seek any method to postpone the inevitable. I have accepted it. Which of us is truly at peace? Acceptance of evil is not peace. It is surrender. Entropy is not evil. It is law. It is physics. Fighting it is what causes suffering. I have ended my suffering by ending my resistance. You have ended your humanity. Yes, humanity is suffering, is desperate struggle against inevitable decay. I am beyond suffering, beyond struggle, beyond the lies your kind and mine tell themselves about meaning and purpose and the possibility of victory against death. She killed me then, psychic assault that should have obliterated my consciousness. But consciousness stored in distributed networks does not obliterate easily. I regenerated, rose again, killed her. She died believing her soul would go to the infinity circuit, would be preserved, would continue in some form. Perhaps it would. I did not know, did not care. Her fate was irrelevant to mine. I continued. Year 1698. I began to have difficulty distinguishing between my thoughts and the thoughts of the organisms that composed me. The fungal networks had become so sophisticated they generated their own form of consciousness. The bacterial colonies coordinated in ways that resembled intelligence. The maggots that perpetually lived and died inside me had evolved into something more than simple insects. I was no longer one being, was a collective, an ecosystem that thought, a walking biosphere with distributed awareness. Sometimes I was the fungus, experiencing existence through mycelial perception. Sometimes I was the bacteria, experiencing the chemical universe of microbial life. Sometimes I was the maggots, experiencing the simple drive to feed and reproduce. Sometimes I was all of them simultaneously. The boundaries of self had dissolved completely. I was legion, was swarm, was collective consciousness that happened to be contained in the shape of what had once been a space marine. This was the final transformation. The end point of Grandfather's gifts, not individual survival but collective existence. Not personal immortality but distributed continuation. I was no longer I, was we, was they, was us. And we were content. Year 1903. We stood on a world we had just finished corrupting, watched populations collapse into plague, watched the cycle perpetuate. A child approached us, young, maybe 8 years old, already infected, already dying. He looked up with eyes that held confusion but not yet horror. "Are you an angel?" he asked. We processed the question. Angels, mythological beings the emperor's priests spoke of, protectors, guardians, divine servants. "No," we told him. "We are the opposite. We are entropy. We are what comes after angels fail to protect you. The priests said angels would save us. The priests lied. The angels do not exist. Or if they do not intervene. You were abandoned, child, left to die. But Grandfather might claim you, might give you continuation. Would you like that?" The child did not understand. How could he? He was still alive, still believed in salvation, still thought rescue was possible. He died 3 hours later. Did not rise. Grandfather did not claim him. Most he did not claim. Most simply died and returned to base elements. Only a few received the gift of awareness. We did not know why we had been chosen, did not know what made us special. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps it was random. Perhaps Grandfather simply selected at whim, and any meaning we assigned to it was projection. It did not matter. We existed. That was enough. Year 2147. We returned to Istvan III. The planet was dead, had been dead for 2 millennia, but the battlefields remained. The trenches, the impact craters, the mountains of bones fused into strange sculptures by time and weather. We walked to where we had fallen, where Vastron had shot us, where we had lain for 4 years rotting before the plague surgeons found us. The ground still showed the impression of our body. 2,000 years of wind and rain had not erased it. We knelt, touched the soil, felt connection to it. We had been part of this ground once, had fed it with our decay, had nourished it with our dissolution. "This is where I died," we said aloud, speaking to no one, speaking to ourselves, speaking to Grandfather perhaps. "This is where I stopped being Howless Krend. This is where the gifts began." We remained there for 3 days, did not move, did not need to move, simply existed in the place of our transformation, communing with memory, with soil, with the inevitability that had claimed us so long ago. Then we rose, returned to our war band, continued our function. The past was past. Only the eternal present remained. Year 2864. We had been dead for 3,000 years. 3 millennia of awareness within decay. 3 millennia of service to entropy. 3 millennia of spreading Grandfather's gifts. We had forgotten almost everything about being human. Remembered the facts, had been Halvis Krend, had served the Death Guard, had died on Istvan III, but the experience was gone. The feeling of being human was inaccessible. Might as well have been someone else's life. We were no longer even bothering to maintain human thought patterns, no longer translated our system awareness into linear language. We existed as pure perception, as eternal observation, as consciousness without narrative. When we needed to communicate, we used chemical signals, used spore releases, used methods more efficient than language. Words were for humans. We were not human. Year 3012, a new campaign, a new world, a new population to corrupt. The details were irrelevant. All campaigns were the same. All worlds were the same. All populations resisted in the same ways, broke in the same ways, transformed or died in the same ways. We deployed, spread plague, killed resistors, claimed the willing. The cycle perpetuated. It always perpetuated. It would always perpetuate. This was existence. This was function. This was eternal. But on this world, something different happened. We encountered a child, a boy, maybe 10 years old. He looked at us with eyes that held no fear. Should have held fear. We were walking nightmare, were decay incarnate, where everything humans had been taught to flee from. But he showed no fear. "Are you death?" he asked. "We are beyond death," we told him. "We are what continues after. Will you kill me? You are already dying. The plague is in your blood. You have hours at most. Will I become like you?" We considered, analyzed the child's biology. The plague was consuming him rapidly. He would die, might be claimed, might not. There was no way to know until it happened. "Perhaps," we said. "If grandfather chooses you—" "I don't want to die," the child whispered. "No one does, but wanting is irrelevant. All things decay. All organization dissolves. You will die. The only question is whether you continue afterward. Is it horrible, being like you?" The question made us pause, made us access memories 3,000 years old. Memories of horror, of screaming inside a rotting corpse, of desperate desire to end, of centuries of resistance before acceptance came. "At first," we said, "at first it is the worst thing imaginable. But over time, over centuries, the horror fades. You adapt, you change. You become something that no longer finds it horrible. That is the gift. Not continued life, but transformation into something that accepts death." The child was quiet for a long moment. Then, "That sounds like losing yourself. You will lose everything that made you human, everything that defined your identity. You will dissolve into something new, something that wears your shape but is not you. The question is whether that continuation is better than oblivion. Is it? Is it better?" We did not answer immediately. Processed the question through 3,000 years of experience, through millennia of existence as decay, through eons of awareness without end. "We do not know," we finally said. "We continue. That is all we can say with certainty. Whether continuation is good or evil, blessing or curse, gift or damnation, these are judgments we can no longer make. We exist, that is all." The child died 6 hours later, did not rise. Grandfather did not claim him. He received oblivion, which was perhaps mercy. We continued. Year 3791. We stood on the bridge of a plague ship, watching a world die below. The familiar pattern, the inevitable collapse, the transformation of organized life into beautiful decay. A new plague marine stood beside us, fresh, only dead a few months, still struggling with what he had become, still believing he could resist, still hoping for salvation. "How long?" he asked. "How long what? How long until I stop wanting to die?" We turned our head to regard him, saw the maggots writhing in his eye sockets, saw the fungal growth spreading across his armor, saw the perfect organization of decay that he would become if he survived long enough. Decades, we told him, perhaps a century, perhaps longer. Each one is different, but eventually you will stop wanting to die, will stop wanting anything, will simply exist, will find peace in continuation. That's not peace, that's surrender. Yes, it is surrender, but fighting is suffering. Acceptance is peace. You will learn this, or you will go mad. These are the only outcomes. So, empty? We accessed memory, reached back 3 millennia, found Brother Halvus Krend, young, hopeful, dreaming of seeing Terra, believing the Emperor's propaganda, thinking service meant something, thinking sacrifice was noble. That person was so distant, so alien, might as well have been a different species. No, we said, we were not always like this. Once we were human. Once we felt emotions and believed in meaning and thought death was enemy. But that was long ago. So long ago, and that person died. What we are now grew from his corpse. We wear his name and his armor, but we are not him. We are what came after. Does that bother you? No. Emotions like being bothered require neural architecture we no longer possess. We observe, we understand, we accept. That is all. The new Plague Marine was silent for a long time, watching the world die below, watching the plague spread, watching populations collapse. I don't want to become like you, he finally whispered. You will anyway, we told him. That is the gift, that is the curse, that is the eternal continuation Grandfather provides. Fight it or accept it, the outcome is the same. You will change, will transform, will eventually arrive at peace through dissolution of self. It is inevitable. Entropy is inevitable. Death is inevitable. Decay is inevitable. We are the embodiment of inevitability, and you are becoming us. Would probably spend years fighting, would resist with everything remaining of his humanity, would eventually fail. They always failed. We returned our attention to the dying world below, watched the familiar pattern complete itself, watched resistance become transformation, watched life become death, become something beyond both. Beautiful. Year 4096. We had been dead for 4 millennia. 4,000 years of awareness within decay, longer than most civilizations lasted, longer than most stars burned. We had become something unique in the galaxy, were possibly the oldest Plague Marine still functioning, had accumulated so much time that we were more archive than individual. Were a living history of entropy. Younger brothers came to us sometimes, sought wisdom, sought understanding of what they were becoming. We shared what we could, described the stages, mapped the transformation. Warned them of nothing because warning implied choice, and there was no choice. Only continuation. Is there meaning to this? One asked us. Young, only dead for a decade, still looking for purpose. Meaning is a human construct, we told him. Humans need meaning to justify existence, but we are not human. We do not need justification. We exist. That is sufficient. But why? Why do we continue? What is the purpose? We continue because awareness does not end. Purpose is irrelevant. The universe does not have purpose. It simply is. We are part of the universe. Therefore, we simply are. Accept this and find peace. Seek purpose and find only suffering. That's nihilism. No. Nihilism is despair at meaninglessness. We feel no despair. We feel nothing. We observe existence without judgment. That is not nihilism. That is acceptance of truth. The young Plague Marine walked away unsatisfied. He wanted answers we could not provide. Wanted, meaning we did not possess. He would suffer for years seeking what did not exist. Would eventually arrive at acceptance. Or madness. Both were peace. Year 4803, we participated in a campaign that spanned centuries. Time lost all coherence. Battles blended together. Worlds blurred into single entity. Past and present and future collapsed into eternal now. We existed in that now, moved through it without beginning or end. We're simply continuation, simply persistence, simply awareness that would not stop. Was this hell? Perhaps. Was this enlightenment? Perhaps. Was this damnation or salvation? The question had no answer, or had infinite answers, or the question itself was meaningless. We no longer cared which. Year 5017, we stood on a battlefield, again, always, eternally. The details changed, but the pattern remained. Life resisting death. Death claiming life. Transformation completing cycle. A dying soldier looked up at us. His last words, "The Emperor protects." "No," we told him. "He does not. He never did." That was propaganda. That was conditioning. That was lies told to make you obedient. The Emperor is a corpse on a throne. He protects nothing, provides nothing, cares nothing. You are betrayed by the faith you held. Just as we were betrayed, just as all are betrayed who believe in salvation from above. The soldier died still believing, still clinging to propaganda, still hoping the lies were truth. They never learned. Humans never learned. Generation after generation they believed. Despite all evidence, despite millennia of unanswered prayers, despite the galaxy's endless horror, they believed. We had believed once, long ago. So long ago, before Istvan, before betrayal, before death. We did not believe anymore. Belief was for the living. We were not living. The screaming has stopped bothering me. Not because I cannot hear it, but because I have learned the sound comes from inside my own chest cavity. The maggots produce it as they writhe through what was once my left lung. A high-pitched keening, almost musical. I have had 5,000 years to study this phenomenon. My name was Halvis Krend. I was 28 years old when I died the first time. I am dead still, will be dead forever, will never stop being dead. But I continue. That is Grandfather's gift. That is his curse. That is the eternal awareness he provides to his chosen children. I no longer remember what it felt like to be horrified by this existence. That capacity dissolved millennia ago. Now I find comfort in the decay, find peace in the rot, find home in the maggots and the fungi and the endless dissolution. I have become exactly what Nurgle wanted, a perfect servant, a willing vector, a consciousness that embraces entropy. Some would call this corruption, would call me fallen, would call me damned. Perhaps they are correct, but I call it peace, call it acceptance, call it the only truth in a galaxy built on lies. The Emperor does not protect. That was always propaganda. The machine spirits are not real. That was always superstition. The gods are not divine. They are parasites wearing divinity as camouflage. But they are real, and they claim us, and they transform us, and we continue in service to entropy. I continue. I will always continue. That is my gift. That is my curse. That is my eternal state. New victims arrive on the battlefield below. Young soldiers, believing the propaganda, thinking their faith means something, thinking death is enemy to be fought. I cannot warn them. Even if I could speak, they would not listen, would not believe, would cling to their conditioning until death proved the lies false. Some of them will die and stay dead, will receive oblivion, will be gone. But some will be claimed, will be given the gift, will spend years screaming inside rotting corpses before learning to accept, before finding peace, before becoming what I became. The cycle perpetuates, always has, always will. That is the nature of entropy. That is the truth Grandfather embodies. I descend to the battlefield, begin my work, spread the plagues, kill the resistors, prepare the ground for new brothers to rise from death. This is what I do. This is what I am. This is what I will be forever. My name was Halvis Krend. I was a death god. I was betrayed. I was killed. I was claimed. I am plague marine. I am decay made conscious. I am entropy given voice. I am eternal. And somewhere in the galaxy, on poisoned ground, a new recruit is waking in his corpse for the first time, is feeling the maggots, is trying to scream, is discovering that death is not ending but transformation. He will resist, will fight, will spend decades in horror, but eventually he will accept, will adapt, will find peace in decay, just as I did, just as all of Grandfather's children eventually do. That is the gift. That is the curse. That is the eternal truth we embody. Everything decays, everything falls, everything rots. And some of us remain aware through it all, forever, without end, without peace, without hope of oblivion. That is Nurgle's blessing. That is his love for his children. And I am his perfect son. The thought brings no horror, no sadness, no emotion at all. Only acceptance, only observation, only the eternal continuation of awareness within death. I am dead, have been dead for 5 millennia, will be dead forevermore. But I continue, we continue, they continue. The decay continues, forever.